Welcome wherever you're joining us from around the world. The theme of this evening is small but mighty, and that's a description that of course could apply to Durrell itself. So with that, on with the show. Welcome to an iconic setting, the British Library, to celebrate an extraordinary organisation and chat about some pretty remarkable people, as well as animals, of course, and projects. So wonderful to see everyone here tonight. It's going to be a great evening. My name's Monty Halls, and the reason I know it's going to be a great evening, I've seen a lot of the material you're about to see, and also met some of the people you're about to meet. They are the rock stars of conservation. And that was the expression Lesley used when she said, she was describing Carl. She said he's a rock star, he's a movie star of conservation. You're going to meet the Brad Pitt of conservation this evening. And like I said, some of the stories are ripping yarns. One of the things that really strikes me about this type of work is there's always a danger when you look at these short videos, these neatly edited distillations of projects that have taken years, sometimes decades to come to fruition, that you think, oh, that looks really easy. You know, basically you go to a place, you conserve it, you come home, you have dinner. And actually, of course, the amount of diligence, the amount of effort, the amount of perspiration, inspiration, frustration involved in every single one of these projects is absolutely massive. So that's some of the stories we're gonna tell tonight. Now, my particular link with Durrell, by the way, is like so many of us. Gerald Durrell lit the blue touch paper for me when I was a kid about conservation. You know, that extraordinary sequence of books and the films, and of course the zoo itself. That's the start of my journey, essentially. So when Lesley got in touch and said, would I like to be an ambassador? I said, of course, I would. And hopefully all of you have had a chance to visit Durrell as well, which is the kind of the mecca, the epicenter of all these extraordinary projects. And I was just telling Lesley very kindly hosted me and my two little girls at Durrell and gave us an extraordinary, life-altering experience, a glimpse behind the scenes, a chance to get in close proximity to so many rare species. That was a once-in-a-lifetime thing for my little girls. And it was also the weekend of the ball, the Durrell Ball. And there was a magician doing the rounds of the tables at the ball who could hammer a 6-inch nail up his nose. And when I said to my two little girls after the weekend, so what will be your lingering memory of this weekend? They said, that bloke, how did he hammer a 6-inch nail? It's all they talked about and still talk about to this day. Just how significant is Durrell? I love the fact that this evening the title is Small but Mighty. And I think that's a fantastic description of Durrell and the way it punches above its weight. And again, I was just chatting to Lesley a little moment ago. She said there was a paper published fairly recently called Avoiding Extinction. And Durrell was either the lead partner or the main instigator in 18% of the animals that were described, single species that had been brought back from the brink of extinction in that paper. And that was streets ahead of any other organisation. So they are hugely significant in terms of the work that they do. But of course, none of that could happen without the support of the people in this room, essentially. And so the first person I'd like to introduce, the first organisation is Rathbones and Rathbone Green Bank, who have been such a staunch supporter of Durrell for many, many years. And with that in mind, I'd like to invite Victoria up on stage. If you want to come up on stage, Victoria, and please take a seat on the sofa. Yeah, so it's Victoria Hoskins, sorry, head of charities on your Rathbones. So, Victoria, why Durrell in particular?
It's really interesting. We were introduced to Durrell through our Jersey office, actually, who have spent many years being strong supporters. But it's a combination of that 5-year work with the lecture. The organisation is, I suppose, that flag flag organisation, especially on Jersey, with respect to how time matters. And you've mentioned it, time matters when it comes to the work that you do. And what we do at Greenbank, it's not instant when we invest in organisations and invest for change and invest for those companies that want to either provide solutions to the problems that we're facing in society. And I think there's a strong echo between that and more importantly these days when we're seeing, as you've mentioned, extinction, a million species I understand at the moment, currently on that extinction list. It's got to be at the top of the agenda because society, nature conservancy, all interlinks, and then that interlinks with prosperity of economies as well. So I think investment, there's that opportunity for investment and nature conservancy and biodiversity to all link together as one ecosystem.
It's very true, and the key word there I think is ecosystem, isn't it? It's all part of a bigger picture. Investing and supporting efforts like this are all part of a bigger picture, actually.
Yeah, and that's going on at the moment. But without that combination of private sector money, public sector money, governments, and then NGOs and charities, all working together in their particular fields, but linking up, if we don't have that combination, I don't think we're ever going to solve those issues that we're facing.
No. So true. That sort of multi-stakeholder thing's key, isn't it? So,
absolutely.
Lovely. Well, Victoria, thank you so much for the support of Rathbones. It's massively
You're very welcome.
Thank you. And there's an interesting point there, I think. I find it impossible to speak sitting down for some reason. There's a really interesting point there, I think, about the whole ecosystem thing that, again, the videos you're going to see tonight, the people you're going to meet, they're on the front line, essentially. They're the gladiators. They're the special forces that are kind of ex-military men who are kind of dropping in and doing the work absolutely at the coalface. And as I said, it's brutal and it's demanding and it's debilitating and physically it's extremely hard and requires real dedication. So in a way, they're your kind of apex predators within that ecosystem. Obviously, sitting on top of it all, you've got the matriarch, the big tusker, that's Lesley, the silverback. But then you've got your kind of apex predators. And then you move through the ecosystem and you've got all the staff in Jersey that are making these things happen, all the people on the ground in each of the locations where Durrell operates. They're another level of the ecosystem and they're absolutely crucial. They're all interconnected. But what's the most important part of any ecosystem? And that's the basis of it, krill, essentially. I'm not saying you're krill, but krill, or plants or whatever. And without that foundation, no ecosystem can function. And what that foundation, talking in brutal, hard business terms, is in this business is funding. Without the funding, none of these projects can take place. That whole ecosystem tumbles. So it's so important. Evenings like this are so important. So we'll swiftly get on to we'll do it right now, get on to the main event. There's no man on planet Earth who has saved more individual species. Is it invertebrates? Vertebrates. Saved more vertebrate species than the man you're about to meet. He's an absolute icon of conservation. He's worked for Durrell for 44 years, 4.5 decades of knowledge. 4.5 decades, as I said, working right on the front line of conservation. So please, a massive round of applause for Professor Carl Jones, MBE.
Thank you very much, Monty. There was no need to exaggerate like that.
No. So, Carl, we've got a lot to talk about. So, and it's really, one of the first questions, we talked about this earlier, and I think it's a really important point to address early on, is Durrell prides itself, its DNA is saving individual species. But surely there's an argument to say, no, you should be saving ecosystems. So what's the rationale for individual species?
Well, that's very interesting because when Gerry Durrell started the work in the 1950s, of course, people were thinking about conservation as saving various animals. A lot of interest with elephants and whales and hippopotamuses and all sorts of large animals. And Jerry said, well, hang on a minute, there's all these other species out there, all these wonderful small species that people know nothing about. And so he started working on species. And then as time went on, people said, hang on a minute, there's so much to be done in terms of conservation. Shouldn't we really be putting our resources into whole systems, ecosystems? And I remember when I was in university in the 1970s, we had to write essays on whether or not you save species or put resources into habitats and ecosystems. And this has been a big debate in conservation biology to this day. But you know what's really interesting is that our work, the work that Durrell has done, working on rare species all over the world, we have found that when you actually work on a particular species over time, it actually drives ecosystem restoration and habitat protection. For example, I started my work on the island of Mauritius, working on the Mauritius kestrel. And people used to say to me, why are you trying to save one bird? We've got to save the whole system. Anyway, we said, no, we've got to, clearly systems work because of all the species there. We've got to save the species as well as saving the systems. But after a few years, the government started to say, hey, we've done all this work on the kestrel. We need somewhere for it to live. So they set up a national park, and the justification was the Mauritius kestrel. And similarly, the work we did on round island reptiles, we started working with Gunther's geckos and tailfish skinks, rather small, insignificant animals, but that has driven the restoration of that whole system. And I think that species conservation is more potent and achieves more in terms of restoring ecosystems than if you start with the systems themselves. Because that whole concept of saving systems just doesn't capture the imagination like trying to work with a pygmy hog. And in Durrell, we've got a strategy, and rewilding our world, we start with species, and we use those to put back their habitats, to restore the habitats, to rebuild systems. In Assam, we work with the pygmy hog, the world's rarest pig, another species we've saved from possible extinction, and that is driving the restoration of the grasslands.
It's interesting, Carl. While we were chatting earlier, I had to stop because I said, Carl, we're going to have our best conversation over there before anyone arrives. So we had to stop. And one of the things Carl taught me through, he said, is timescales now, because conservation projects, by necessity, have to work in short timescales to try and turn things around and have to be constantly attended to, because you don't save a species and then it's done. It's a constant ongoing process. But one of the things, Carl, you mentioned to me, is this is a 100-year process. They're 100-year timescales now. And there's a great Maori expression that says, be a good ancestor, plant trees you will never see. And now is an opportunity for us to be really good ancestors and get these programs really going. That long time scale thing is quite interesting, isn't it, Carl?
Well, that's a good point, because if you think back to the conservation organizations in the 1960s and 70s, they'd have the year of the tiger, the year of the whale, and they were short-term projects. And it was all, let's put money into tigers for a few years and save them, and then they move on. But Gerry Durrell always said, we cannot save wildlife in just a year or two. It's going to take time. And that's actually true. We have now been involved in some of our programs for 4 and 5 decades, and we found that you work with one species, it starts driving the restoration of other species, associated species in the systems, and eventually whole ecosystems. But it does take decades. There is no doubt about that. You cannot save species overnight. You've got to make that long-term commitment. And of course, when you do make a long-term commitment, it's not always easy. You get lots of problems, lots of ups and downs, but you've got to stick in there through thick and thin.
We're going to move on to individual species examples in a minute, and we'll show you a couple of films. But just one last general point, Carl. Where is Durrell's particular area of expertise? You touched on it earlier when we were chatting, saying, oh yeah, captive breeding programs, et cetera, but there's a translation actually out into the field, now into the real world and real ecosystems. And that I thought was a really interesting point. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's quite interesting because Gerry Durrell always felt that the role was zoos should be preserving animals and breeding them. And Gerald Durrell was a collector. He was an animal collector for zoos. And as a young man, he traveled around the world and captured various animals and sold them to zoos. And then he thought, this is wrong. What we should be doing is using animals for conservation. So his original vision was to set up captive breeding projects and then breed the animals and let them go. And of course, we do a little bit of that, but actually what's really important is to be able to take the skills that you develop in a zoo and apply them in the wild to manage species there. And there's a sort of interface between wild and captivity. When you consider that species are critically endangered, and very often they've been declining for years or even centuries in some cases, you can't restore them overnight, and you've got to help them. And it is the skills that you develop in a zoo that actually help you put those animals back, understanding the needs of the animals. And zookeepers are really good at this, because people who keep animals in captivity, they develop a sort of intuition, and they can think like the animals they're working with.
Yeah, yeah. And that's really crucial, isn't it, for making that jump? Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of captive breeding unless you're...
Absolutely. It's got to be getting them back into the wild. It's really quite interesting because Jerry changed his views over his lifetime. And he originally thought that it was zoos would be arks where we just had animals and we keep them there very long term. But towards the end of his life, he really appreciated how we could take the skills of a zoo and apply them in the field. And of course, we've set up projects all over the world. Yeah. And this is what we'll be talking about this evening.
Well, let's have a look at a couple of those projects now then. So the first one is the Saint Lucia racer, which I'm reliably informed is the rarest snake in the world. So can you tell us about the snake briefly, Carl, and why Durrell got involved?
The Saint Lucia racer became extinct on Saint Lucia perhaps a century or so ago due to rats and cats and mongooses, all these introduced species that would prey upon it. And it was thought to be extinct. And then in 1973, it was discovered on Maria Major, which is this small island off the coast of St. Lucia. And this island is being modified by climate change. It's drying as the years go by. And it seems the snake is going to die out there quite soon unless we do something about it. And so we are going to set up a program to try and save the St. Lucia racer. And we're going to try and breed them in captivity and have them in enclosures on the island and perhaps eventually get them into the wild. But we'll talk about that later.
Wonderful. So that's sort of classic Durrell, isn't it? That is classic Durrell, coming in to address a critical time pressing issue around a single species, turning that around and then looking at a reintroduction. I've got a question here, Carl. It says, why are snakes so important? Why bother about a tiny snake? I think you've answered that question to a degree, but...
Okay, you may say, well, so what if we lose a tiny snake? And you're asking me as a biologist why. And I suppose you expect me to talk about the ecology and how it fits into the ecosystem and so on. Well, actually, we don't know because we know very little about this snake. But let's think about it another way. Durrell has worked with critically endangered species worldwide. We worked with the world's rarest bird, the Mauritius kestrel. We work with the world's rarest pig, the pygmy hog, the world's rarest tortoise, the plowshare tortoise in Madagascar. And we've been able to prevent those species becoming extinct. Perhaps we haven't saved them yet, but we're well on the way to doing it. And without our help, they would have disappeared. Now, I want you to think for a moment. We've got a biodiversity crisis worldwide. We're going to be losing lots of species. If you can save the world's rarest, you can save them all. And I think that's something we should embrace. There is far too much doom and gloom in the world. And people saying we're going to be losing all these species. I think it's inevitable we're going to be losing some. But we have the potential to save them all.
I think it's... you said that to me earlier, Carl, and it really stuck with me. That if you can save the rarest ones, the ones that are in the most trouble, that are right on the cliff edge, just think what you can do for the other ones. So I think that's a wonderful sort of touchstone for everything that Durrell does. And we've now got an opportunity to see a film. We're going to meet Sapphira, who's been working with Durrell and Saint Lucia for a number of years after attending the Desmond training course in Jersey in 2019. So with any luck, we can roll that film.
It's important to me to protect the Saint Lucia racer, mainly because the home of the world's rarest snake is in the community where I come from, based in Vieux Fort, the southern part of Saint Lucia, on the Maria Islands on mainly Maria Major. I will take great pride in wanting to protect a species that's only surviving in my community. The Saint Lucia racer is under threat from the introduction of Asian mongoose and rodents onto the mainland island of Saint Lucia, and it has wiped off the racers from the mainland, with the only population remaining on Maria Major. Team Durrell Saint Lucia, alongside Forestry Department and other governmental agencies, are working closely to develop a captive breeding on the mainland island. Currently, we are undergoing some surveys for racers in the field, where we're going to find a juvenile male to take into captivity and to breed. Jersey Zoo is playing an important role in ensuring the future of the Saint Lucia racer by getting an analog species from Anguilla, which is the Anguilla racer, breeding it in captivity, and developing the husbandry protocols that we can mimic on the Saint Lucia racer in captivity when we do find one from the wild. We're working in some tough terrain under some high temperatures, and it's physically tiring and draining. You never know how long you're going to stay there for. In case of emergencies, we always work in teams of 3. So if anyone on that team is injured, there are 2 persons to carry you out, mainly because the hospital is far from most of our sites that we work in. Being the racer is so elusive, when we do get one, that is a great reward for myself and the full team. Working with local communities has been a challenge for the past couple of years, mainly because of COVID-19. But in the past, we would have gone out and do education and outreach, and now it would be in the form of school visits and private talks at institutions, letting them know that the work we're doing currently on the Maria Islands. And I can safely say people from the community of Vieux Fort take great pride in knowing that we are doing something towards conserving the wildlife, especially the racer, which is found only on Maria Islands in Saint Lucia. My hope for this species is that we can successfully breed it in captivity and set up a second population on the mainland island site, and then that will enable us to save the species from extinction. Considering the Saint Lucia racer being the world's rarest snake, and we are trying to save it from extinction, your donations will go a long way in enabling Durrell to work towards that program and set up a second population on the mainland island of Saint Lucia, and thus making you more proud to donate to our project. Thank you for giving hope to the world's rarest snake.
There's a couple of things that come across listening to Sapphira speak there, Carl. One of them is a question. What is an analog species?
An analog is when you work with another species to develop the techniques. And this is something that we've been doing a great deal of in Durrell, is that if you've got a critically endangered species, you don't want to sort of experiment with it to find out how to manage it and look after it in captivity. So you'll get something which is quite closely related and very similar, and you'll develop the skills with that. And what you're doing is you're learning about the biology of a closely related species, so you can apply that knowledge. But those people are also learning deep knowledge about the species. They're learning all sorts of aspects. It's not just learning how to feed it or what have you, but they're trying to get into the mind of the species. And I mentioned this earlier on. Zookeepers are very, very good at being able to think like the animals they work with. I'm not sure we can think like a snake, but at least we can second guess what their needs are. And this is what you do with analogues. And it's something we've done over the years with a whole range of species, both on our overseas programs. We work with a very rare duck in Madagascar, but we learned a lot of those skills in Jersey Zoo on the ferruginous duck. And we do a lot of work with various species of marmosets and tamarins. And we started with common species, and over the years we've scaled up so that we can now work with the most endangered species. And we have got several members of staff who can think like tamarins and marmosets. There's no two ways about that.
Well, yeah, I noticed that when I visited, by the way. But one of the things that really leaps out about that video, the most important species in that video was Saphira. You've got an energized, mobilized, committed, intelligent member of the local population there running that program and driving it on. How significant is that part of the work for Durrell, making sure that she is equipped to do her work and educated?
That's what Durrell's about. In all our programs, we work with local organizations and with the government, and we work with local biologists. And we are just there as a catalyst to help them and to mentor. And this is one of the main roles that Durrell has, is that over time we mentor the organizations we work with. And we also work very closely with the government. And of course, governments change, but we carry on and we work with them. But we also do a lot of training. And we get young people from all over the world come to our academy in Jersey, and we teach them the skills of working in the field and conservation biology. But also, we stay in contact with them and we help them develop in their career. And one of the things we've been trying to do in recent years is to see how we can actually transfer knowledge between projects. So we work with people, say, in one country on tortoises, and then we put them in touch with people in other countries. And this is what we're trying to do, is to set up a network of people involved with Durrell working on similar endangered species. And it's quite interesting because there are a lot of very narrow views when it comes to conservation. People say, this is how you should do it. Whereas actually, there are lots of problems out there, and we've got to be creative. And this is what we're trying to do, is to get people from different cultures together to think about what is possible.
That sort of cross-pollinization.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You never underestimate local knowledge as well, you know, should you? So we're staying in the Caribbean, and we're going to hop across to Montserrat to learn about the mountain chicken, which is in fact not a chicken, but a giant frog. So, Carl, please tell us about the mountain chicken and why Durrell got involved in that project.
In 1997, the island of Montserrat, there was a huge volcanic explosion that wiped out the main city there of Plymouth. And it was felt that the volcano could go up and everything could be lost. And Durrell was approached to help with some of the endemic species that existed there. And we sent some people across, and we caught some Montserrat orioles, which is a small bird, and we brought back mountain chickens. And the mountain chicken is the most beautiful frog. They weigh up to 1 kilo. It's one of the big 5. It's one of the 5 biggest frogs in the world. It's amazing. And we were very fortunate in the zoo that we were able to breed the orioles and also breed the frogs. And you know, this frog, although it had been very common, being found on Montserrat and also on Dominica, nobody had ever seen them breeding. And we found that they had the most remarkable breeding system, that the females go deep into a burrow where they lay their eggs in a foam nest, and then when the tadpoles hatch, they feed the tadpoles on unfertilized eggs. And so there's this unique reproductive system which is completely unknown. And we were able to describe that because we had the animals in captivity. Anyway, the situation on Montserrat stabilized with the volcano, but we were well aware that there was a disease, a pandemic spreading around the world called chytrid mycosis, which is a fungal disease that kills frogs. And in the early 2000s, the only other wild population of this frog on Dominica got infected by chytrid. And it was thought for a while that it was totally extinct on the island. And it seemed inevitable that it would get to Montserrat. So we in Durrell said we need a plan. If chytrid ever gets to Montserrat, we're going to have to go across there and see what we can do to help. And then in 2009, chytrid hit Montserrat. And we sent a group over to work with the people in the forestry department and with the National Trust there. And we had a rescue mission to bring back 50 frogs to Britain. And working with Chester Zoo and London Zoo, we set up a breeding program. And that was the start of a sort of our big involvement with the mountain chicken.
Well, I've mentioned earlier that the extraordinary dedication required to operate effectively in the field and to push these things through and just to keep going against these overwhelming odds. And Carl, you told me a story about gathering specimens, basically, that went way beyond anything I've ever heard a scientist having to do to get a specimen. Can you just paraphrase that story?
I will do. It was quite interesting because I've never been to Montserrat, although I know about mountain chickens because they're fantastic and we got them in the zoo. But I wanted to find out a little bit more about their biology, so I started talking to the biologists that had worked on the mountain chicken. And they started telling me about how many eggs they laid and how long they lived and about the length of the burrows and so on. And I said, tell me a bit more. And they started telling me about chytrid and so on. I said, no, what was it like working in the field with them? And I was speaking to Sarah Louise, who was one of our staff who spent 4 years working in Montserrat. And I said, tell me about what you used to do day to day. And she said, we used to go up into the forest. We used to drive up to the study site where we were working on the mountain chickens, a place called Fairy Walk. I thought, wonderful, a beautiful tropical valley, idyllic.
No one says valley like a Welshman, by the way.
Well, they call it a gut over there. But anyway,
there we
a
go.
sort of deep ravine.
Yeah.
And I thought, idyllic, studying frogs on a tropical island. And I said, well, it must have been very nice. She said, well, actually, she said, there was a lot of volcanic activity at the time, and the air was heavy with the smell of sulfur. And where we'd park our Land Rover, you'd see the lava coming down the slopes, creating red-hot streams. And she said, to get to the study site was a 2-hour walk. I said, what, 2 hours? She said, yeah, it took us 2 hours to get in there. And I said, and what did you do when you got there? And she said, well, we had a 900-meter transect, and we'd go up there and we'd catch frogs, and we were doing all sorts of studies on them. We weren't only just bringing some back, but we were studying them, and we were treating some to see whether we could cure the disease. Anyway, so we'd be collecting samples and studying the frogs. And she said that that would take 2 hours. And then at the end of the day, we'd come back and another 2-hour walk. And then when we got to the truck, we'd all have to strip off because we'd been handling these diseased frogs. And we'd all have to scrub down, and we'd have to put on clean clothes, which we then had to bag. Then we'd all have to go back to the field station and sort out all our samples, which would take another few hours, and wash our clothes in bleach. And I said, my God, how long did you do that for? Oh, 6 days a week for 7 months. I said, what? But hang on a minute, it was really exciting because she started to talk about it. And I started to feel some real emotion. And she started to say that when they started the study, they would be finding 100 frogs a day in any night transect. But within 4 months, it had gone down to 5 on average. And within 18 months, the population had gone from a vibrant population to none at all. Mm. And I said, well, what was it like? I said, did you ever see any dead frogs? He said, yeah, we found lots of dead frogs. And he'd be walking in in the gut, in the ravine, and he'd just be overwhelmed with the smell of death and decomposition. And she said that the people that were most affected by that were these burly foresters who, as young people, had been frog hunters. And they kept saying, these are our frogs. We've got to save them. And they were the people most motivated.
Yeah.
We just had one of our staff out there, but working with a team of Montserrat forestry workers. And they were the people who are really passionate about bringing these frogs back. And of course, at that time, just think of the desperation. Everybody thought the frog was going to become extinct. So it was very desperate, and just think of that dedication of the people. And another thing that Sarah Louise told me, she said it was 30 degrees, and you'd be bathed in sweat. And because of all the pyroclastic activity, there was volcanic dust on all the leaves, and that would stick to your skin, and it was very acidic, so it became very irritating. So you'd be working for 6 hours in the field, at 30 degrees.
Covered in acid.
Covered in an acidic dust.
Yeah, yeah.
And hang on a minute, you know that. No, but this is really important, because I started working for Durrell because I was interested in doing something with endangered species. But the one thing that has really affected me are the people we work with. Just how dedicated they are and what we're all achieving. It's really amazing. And I think this is one of the things which very few people realize is just the caliber of people we work with in Durrell. They're not just scientists. They're people with great drive, passion, and a lot of common sense.
And one of the things you said, Carl, is that the local people there were desperate to save the mountain chicken because of the noise, the song of the forest. Was that the expression you used?
Well, I said to Sarah Louise, I said, look, you know, you're saving these frogs. What do the locals think? They said, look, they really want their frogs back. And I said, is that because they eat them? They said, yes, but they really like the frogs. And she said that many of the local people have come up to her and said, please bring back the frogs, because the forest is no longer singing at night. I said, what? She says, well, at night, because there were hundreds of frogs in the forest, it would be singing. And I said, what do you mean singing? And she says, they make this beautiful noise. And she said, you'd hear it everywhere, hundreds of frogs. And they're now missing that.
Of course. Yeah, such an important part of cultural life and cultural memory.
Absolutely.
And everything, isn't it? As so many of these species are. So, right, well, without further ado, we'll meet Luke, who's leading Durrell's program on the ground in Montserrat. So if we can show that short film, that'd be great.
The mountain chicken is under threat due to a deadly amphibian fungus known as chytridiomycosis. It's spread around the globe and is found on every continent that amphibians are found, and is responsible for the extinction of 200 amphibian species globally. Myself and the team out in Montserrat, we're caretakers of 21 mountain chicken frogs on the island in a safe haven. So we have these individuals, and essentially we're trying to see, can we create some resistance within the frogs from this deadly fungus? Can we aid them in survival in the wild and essentially rewild them back into their habitat on Montserrat? The team and I, through various months of the year, May for example, we're out hiking 16 night hikes. Of course, the mountain chicken are a nocturnal species, so we hike across the center hills. Some of these hikes 4-5 hours at a time in the pitch black up mountains. This can be very tiring when you're working the day. You have the mountain chickens to look after, continue the program, do your outreach. It can be very tiresome, but of course that's why we're here as a team, is to do everything we can to protect the mountain chicken frog. One of the most rewarding things about the job is outreach. going to schools, visiting the children, seeing their enthusiasm as they learn about not only the frog but other species, that we teach them about the environment and conservation, and just seeing how excited they get. People are a huge aspect of what we do. We couldn't look after these individual frogs without the support of the communities. This enables us to continue our work on the island. Of course, our greater picture is to rewild Montserrat with mountain chicken in the years to come. For us to do that, we need full support of the community and of the government. So we wouldn't be able to undertake our work without that support. With the mountain chicken being a culturally and historically important species on the island, our work enables us to engage the community and again to keep this species at the forefront of conservation on the island. So I believe we should protect the mountain chicken because it's a charismatic, iconic frog. It's a critically endangered species that is hugely valuable to biodiversity in the Lesser Antilles. We should take every step forward to protect all species and thus maximise our biodiversity globally. Jersey Zoo is vital and has been vital in the survival of the mountain chicken frog. When chytrid hit the island of Montserrat in 2009, the government contacted Durrell and Durrell flew in, and 50 individuals, so 25 males and 25 female mountain chicken frogs, were flown out of Montserrat over here to Europe to create a biosecure population that could then be bred and then rewilded. So our individuals today have come from some of those founding frogs here on Montserrat. Without Durrell, we really wouldn't be where we are today. And we'd love to continue this work and push forward with our mountain chicken program to understand the role that chytrid plays, and if we can create some kind of resistance within those frogs to essentially rewild those back to their habitat. My hope for the mountain chicken frog is that we can understand chytridiomycosis, we can create an environment in which they can be released back into the wild where they will survive or coincide with this fungus, so that we can rewild Montserrat, potentially Dominica in the future. I would love to see the mountain chicken frog population in the wild increase indefinitely. We're asking for your support to continue our vital work with the mountain chicken frog, which will help enable us to return its calls to the forests of Montserrat. Thank you.
So it strikes me you do have a unique perspective. You've worked on the very front line of conservation for 44 years now, and you've worked with local communities, with young scientists. You've seen a lot of these projects come to fruition. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic that you can continue to turn it around?
I'm an optimist, and you have to be an optimist if you're a conservationist. Yes, there are ideals we all want to try and achieve, and I believe that we can actually achieve a great deal. We might not achieve exactly what we want. It may be some form of compromise, but we can get there. And I think it's really interesting, because if you look at the history of Durrell, you mentioned at the very beginning that Durrell has helped avoid the extinction of more species than any other organization on this planet. And you just think about that. We have actually been hugely effective because of our approach, because we're taking the techniques that we've learned and developed in the zoo and applying them to the species in the wild, and we're developing a sort of halfway house. You've seen with the mountain chickens, we have them in these enclosures where we can understand their behavior, understand how the disease works, and understand how we can avoid the disease. So we've got a very special approach, and I think this is our brand, if you like, the sort of interface between the wild and captivity. And we've been developing that for many, many years. And you look at the case of the mountain chicken, we're trying to understand the disease, chytridiomycosis. And when they were studying the frogs in the wild, they found that some of them could catch the disease, and then they could get rid of the disease, but they catch it again, and then unfortunately they died. But the very fact that they could get rid of the disease we found to be very interesting. And it was observed that some of them would be sunbathing. And it was found that the disease cannot survive in high temperatures. And so what we're doing now is within this enclosure, we are providing baths of water of different temperatures so they can actually self-medicate by taking a warm bath to control the disease. Still early days. We've got a lot more work to do, but we're actually trying to find out how we can actually manage the disease while the frogs are actually developing some form of natural resistance. So what we're doing is we're helping them. And it is that help that we've been giving to all the species we work with, whether it be pygmy hogs or whether it be Mauritius kestrels, giving them a helping hand while they recover in the wild, and then stepping back over time. So Durrell is showing the way forward. We've got the answer. We don't have the answer to all the problems, but we have some of them, I can assure you. And also, you just think of this. The work we're doing on individual species is helping to drive whole ecosystems. Now, that is really important because we know that it's complex ecosystems that are important for sequestering carbon. It is the simplified systems where species have become extinct and they become degrading. Those are the ones that lose carbon. So we have one of the answers for the future.
You've been at the heart of so much of what Durrell has done for the last 4 decades. And hearing you speak and hearing your passion and your knowledge and your continued drive, you can really see why so many of these projects have been successful. And there's very few people that actually really deserve this term, but be described as a true force of nature. I think you're a true force of nature. So thank you very much for talking. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a great quote, again, ex-military man, there's a great quote from General Patton that says, "A good plan violently executed is better than a detailed plan delayed." And this is one of the best conservation stories I've ever heard. And we've got kind of the main perpetrators here. Perpetrators is possibly the wrong word, but some of the key actors in this extraordinary drama. And one of the reasons it's so good and it's so effective is it's conservation in action. It's every bit of the Durrell network meshing together to create something absolutely irresistible, which literally saved a species over a course of a few days, basically. So I'm going to get up on the stage. I'm going to be joined by Durrell's indomitable CEO, Dr. Lesley Dickie, and a fearless young man who did something absolutely remarkable in a key phase of this project, essentially, to save this species. And that's Louis Pierre Boulle. So up you come, chaps. Now, the story we're going to tell is how in 2020, in the very midst of the global pandemic, they rescued 3 species of reptile from a devastating oil spill in Mauritius. There's a great expression that President Obama used once, and he said, to reach out and bend the arc of history. And that's what they did. They reached out and they bent the arc of history. So a little introduction to the story is in the little video we're about to see.
It's now 2022, but exactly 2 years ago, on the evening of the 25th of July, the MV Wakashio oil tanker ran aground 2 kilometers from a very important island called Montserrat, a nature reserve that holds unprecedented biodiversity, not only for Mauritius, but for the region of the Southwest Indian Ocean.
What unfolded over the days and weeks that followed was devastating. The ship broke in two and 1,000 tons of toxic oil poured into the ocean. The oil-soaked sea spray rained down on the southeast islets, including Ile de la Passe, Ile Vacqua, Ile aux Fouquet, and Ile Marianne. It was the worst environmental disaster in the history of Mauritius.
Mais lui, là, passé à côté de l'île, là, quand le Wakasha est cassé, est brisé. Toute l'huile est descendue près de l'île, tout autour.
Seeing all the scenes of people helping and scooping up the oil, and just, it was devastation. It was horrible, horrible.
On the 7th of August, nearly 2 weeks after the shipwreck, the Mauritian government declared a national emergency. Thousands of locals did what they could to fight the fuel. Their livelihoods had been decimated.
Wakasha fait bien des autres. La vie a changé depuis Wakasha, depuis pareillement longtemps.
My immediate thoughts were we need to bring some of these reptiles off of the islands to capture their unique genetic diversity, because if we lost these animals from these islands, that's it, they are lost forever. All this effort that we've put in for the last 16 years in restoring these communities could be potentially undone in a blink of an eye. It was really emotional time, and just being on the island was almost unbearable. The stench of the oil was just burning our noses, our mouths, getting headaches, but we needed to try and do what we could for the island. It was a huge risk for us because we thought, what would happen if this oil caught alight?
So there we are. That's the scene that was set. So, and that's the news that reached you, wasn't it, Lesley? So what happened from that point on?
Well, yes, we heard from Nick, who we just saw in the film there, who's the head of our program in Mauritius. And as soon as it happened, Nick contacted us and said, this is going to be a disaster, and we need to go and collect some of these small reptiles off the southern islands because they're not going to survive. And we needed to do an awful lot very quickly. But you know, this evening's called Small But Mighty. One of the benefits of being a small organization is that you don't have too many people to make a decision. So we had a chat, talked to our reptile team in Jersey, our team in Mauritius, our communications team, our vets, and said, can we do this? And they all said, yes, we can. We said there was a giant pandemic going on. We still can. And we say, okay, we will do it. And so we've got that flexibility to say, we need to act. We're going to act now. Let's get it done.
Now, the obstacles were, as you say, beyond formidable. I mean, this was mission impossible because, of course, globally, international travel is forbidden. You're dealing with animals here that are very sensitive to temperature, very sensitive to change, sensitive to disruption. There's only a few of them that you've got there. Each one is precious. And so somehow you have to transport those animals thousands and thousands of miles to Jersey. And you've got to do it within hours, within days. So what happened next?
Well, the first thing we needed to do, of course, is say to the Mauritian government, please let us collect these animals. So that's the first kind of, you would say, bureaucratic discussion. But the Mauritian government agreed very quickly because, of course, we've worked there a long time and they know what Durrell does and who we are. And so the first thing we did was an emergency collection of the 3 species, and we took them to Nick's house. Because Nick had set up this rapid kind of little reptile unit in his spare bedroom and just got them there. So we had some animals all ready to go. The next thing we had to say is, but we can't keep them in Nick's spare bedroom. That can't go on. We need to bring them to Jersey, where we have a specialist reptile center, where we have a team who are acknowledged world experts in the reptiles of the Indian Ocean. And the government thought about it again, and this is a big ask to say, you're dealing with an oil spill, the country's closed because of a pandemic, but please pay attention because we want to take 3 species away. So it was a big ask for the government as well, but they responded really positively and said yes. And that was absolutely brilliant. But then, how did we get them to Jersey when there's no international air travel?
And on that very note, I'm going to hand over to Louis-Pierre and indeed Natalie. So when did you hear about this, Louis-Pierre, and when did you make the decision to say, right, we're going to do it? We're going to take charge of that critical link to get the animals to where it's safe?
Well, first of all, when we heard about the disaster, I mean, it was devastating, but it was also pretty surreal because, you know, when you hear about a disaster on television, it's always sad, but it's hard to feel a real connection. And so it's not just that it happened in Mauritius, but it actually happened really on our doorstep. We live right there. So I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt the importance of the reserves there for conservation, with all the islands mentioned and other and marine reserves, all right there in that area.
Because you've got a bit of history, haven't you, with those projects?
Yes.
As a family, you've supported them before.
Yes, but knowing the importance of those areas, it was really, really all the more devastating. So I guess it was really a difficult part of it was not having the control and really not being able to do more. So when we got the call, we were really just honored and felt privileged to be able to help in any way. So it was immediately, yes, let's do this.
So you provided the transport essentially to get the 3 species of lizard to Jersey, but that's making the decision to do it. Of course, the reality of that trip is so fraught with peril that you've got these animals that are so sensitive to temperature, so sensitive to disruption, and essentially you're having to take them on the aircraft yourself and get them over there. You have, for the rest of your lives, if anyone ever judges you, you can stop them and say, stop, I saved a species. What have you done? I saved a species. Or you could have said, stop, I'm going to stop you there. I made 3 species of lizard completely extinct. So the pressure of getting on that aircraft, tell us about that journey.
Well, on the way over, I really didn't know what to expect. It was a pretty unique situation. So when we finally met up with Nick, who we saw in that video just now, who of course was key to the whole operation, he handed us these big wooden boxes, which were not transparent. So I actually never saw the specimens. I never saw the reptiles at all. Could
have been anything.
It was a Schrodinger's box of reptiles. So,
yeah.
So when he handed me the box and he gave me a really stern look and he said, if the temperature goes above a certain amount or below a certain amount, these guys, they're screwed. So you have to really keep an eye on this. And but really keeping in mind the countless hours that Nick and countless other conservationists have done, scientists have done on those islands and other ones, going back decades, to preserve these species, and how that was all thrown into question just by this single disaster. It was a lot of pressure, and I was pretty nervous, to be honest.
How long was the flight?
It was almost 12 hours.
Nice and restful, you watch a film?
I definitely didn't watch a film. I was on the ground next to the thermostat, the 2 thermostats, the 2 boxes, making sure. Unfortunately, on an aircraft, temperature fluctuates quite wildly. So, well, wildly, too wildly for the skinks. So we were having to make adjustments every 5 to 10 minutes of the temperature throughout the flight.
For 12 hours?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, amazing, amazing. And so you landed in Jersey, and at this point, of course, you've got no idea whether it's worked or not, because you can't see in the boxes. You've got no idea. So at that point, again, Lesley, you were part of the reception committee. So what happened then?
Yes, when the plane landed at Jersey Airport, and we were there, myself and Matt, who heads up our reptile team, to meet Louis-Pierre and Natalie, and the box came off. And of course, we didn't know when we took them back to the zoo, but again, we were in the middle of a pandemic, and the restrictions on Jersey meant that Louis, Pierre and Natalie could not leave the tarmac. So they had to get back on the plane and leave. And that was it. So they'd come all this way, checking the temperature, making sure they, got the animals to us in as best condition as possible. And they never got to see them at that point, which was extraordinary. And when we got them back to the zoo, and the reptile team had done an amazing job setting up the rooms and getting all the equipment really, really quickly. That first unboxing was quite nerve-wracking. We got Nick on FaceTime. We held the phone so he could see from Mauritius. And as we started unboxing, every single animal survived.
So what percentage of the animals survived that extraordinary journey?
100%.
100%.
100% of the animals survive. And that in and of itself, you're dealing with these really sensitive little animals. They're tiny little animals. And what was also very exciting as we were starting to unbox, particularly the geckos, we could see that some were pregnant. So we already had the opportunity for the breeding program to begin, because they were pregnant when they arrived. And it was really extraordinary to have that opportunity to act really quickly and to do what we could. But the relief when we opened the box was pretty big.
I mentioned earlier that it's so in the spirit of Jerry, the whole thing, I think, to cut through red tape, to take this thing on that seems absolutely impossible in order to directly save a species of an animal, to use a series of motivated and good people at every stage to make sure that it works seamlessly. All these links in that logistical chain, if one of them had fallen down, that would have been it. And so I wonder, if the spirit of Jerry was there watching you open those boxes, he would have been like, fair play.
I think he would have been pleased. I think so, because of course there was so many links in the chain, down to even, we spent several days liaising with the ports of Jersey on the island, liaising with Heathrow, because what we were doing was so unusual. We had to get all the authorities involved. What paperwork did we need? Were we allowed to skip some paperwork occasionally? How did we get them there? And so many people helped us do this, because I also think, the world was going through this pandemic event. There was lots of uncertainty, but this was an opportunity to do something completely different that would make a real difference and give all of us a little power back in this extraordinary year where we felt quite powerless. But this we could do, this we could act upon, and this was a really galvanizing, exciting project for everyone that got involved.
Well, Louis Pierre and Natalie, a couple of questions for you. Number one is, what you were being asked to do is make a substantial financial outlay. You were also potentially putting yourself in line for logistics, issues in terms of legislation, trying to move across the globe in the middle of a pandemic, so potentially creating a lot of problems for yourself there, putting yourself in physical harm because you're heading to another country, you've no idea, pandemic-wise, et cetera, et cetera. How long did it take you to make the decision when you were approached?
It was more or less instantaneous. As I mentioned earlier, we were really devastated by the oil spill, and we were really honored to be able to help in any way. And if it was an effective way, then all the better.
So you had a 12-hour flight back, and then when did you find out that you'd been totally successful?
We went home, and we essentially got an email, and we were really happy. I was really happy to hear that they were gravid. I had to look up what that means, basically, pregnant for reptiles. Nick told me that most of the mating happened either in nature or in his apartment. But I'd like to think of...
I've heard that about Nick's apartment.
Yeah. I like to think of it as kind of a skink mile high club, if he'll allow me that. But
yeah, very good, very good. As the next sort of phase of this story was actually having them in the zoo and making sure that they were comfortable and they were going to survive, they're in the right conditions. And you actually got an opportunity a little while afterwards to show Nick his beloved animals actually in the zoo.
Yeah, so that was the other difficult thing. Nick, who's so passionate about the species he works with, he is a reptile expert. That is one of Nick's great passions in life. And of course, he just had to put them in the box and let them go. And because of the pandemic, it was quite some time before Nick could come over to Jersey. But he came over this year and got to meet them all.
Well, on that, we'll watch that video in a moment, but there's a lovely moment with Louis Pierre actually in situ on the island, and you're holding one of them up, aren't you? And you say to Nick, this is the first time I've ever seen one of these, actually, because he did the whole thing without laying eyes on them once. So yeah, we'll have a little look at that video of Nick actually seeing the animals in Jersey Zoo. So here we go.
Wow, Kieran, this is quite a change from 2 years ago. These reptiles were some of the reptiles were in my spare bedroom. All in tubs, all in biosecurity, but this is phenomenal. This is amazing to see.
Some of these will be the ones that you would have caught up yourself and brought over, and some of them are the ones that you would have never met. So I'll introduce you to some of those now.
Yeah, it'd be great to see. But so many mouths to feed, eh?
So luckily we breed our own insects here. Yeah. They do eat a lot. We've got about 14 of the youngsters that we weigh and measure every month. The animals that we brought over originally, we had eggs laid by them a month after they arrived, so they clearly weren't too traumatized by the long flight from Mauritius. So, they're really happy, they're thriving.
Kieran, I'm so pleased, so happy to see all of this. A massive, massive thank you to you and the team.
Natalie and Louis Pierre have also been able to make a visit, exactly 2 years since they touched down in Jersey with the reptiles.
well, it's honestly breathtaking to be in here and to see the progress and little guys who've just been proliferating thanks to all your hard work and Matt's hard work. Yeah,
it's very emotional.
Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And that should be the strap line for Durrell, I think. Always seems impossible until it's done. So what's happening now back on Mauritius?
Well, on Mauritius, Nick and the team are surveying on a regular basis on the islands. The problem with oil spills is we know that the oil can persist in the environment for a very long time, and it can persist in species like reptiles for an extremely long time. I think there's records from a spill in the Caribbean where they were finding oil in reptiles up to 12 years later. So it can be incredibly difficult to get oil out of systems. On the islands, unfortunately, we have seen declines of the remaining species and reptiles on the islands. It could take years.
It shows the significance of actually getting those animals off.
Absolutely, that's why we had to act so quickly. So Nick and the team are on a regular basis going out, surveying, seeing what's happening with the animals, seeing if there's any signs of recovery. And that will go on for a very long time. And of course, at some future point, if the remnant populations don't recover on those islands, at what point do we have to consider a reintroduction from the population in Jersey? Because of course, the populations in Jersey, we've actually expanded the room several times since we've had them over the 2 years, because we've got a lot now. So we're in a kind of maintenance phase with the 3 populations. So the Bossier skink, the Bouton skink, and the night gecko. The Bossiers and the Boutons had never been cared for in captivity before. So first breedings of those animals in captivity. We had cared for night gecko before. So we've learned an awful lot in those 2 years. But ultimately, what we want is them thriving in the wild. So it's keeping a really close eye on the ecosystem, trying to figure out if we're seeing signs of recovery or not. And if so, what do we do next?
And Louis-Pierre, you got an opportunity to visit one of the islets with Nick, didn't you? So what was that?
Well, we went to a few different ones, all the ones mentioned in the video. And well, first of all, it was a huge honor because a lot of them are protected, so it was really excellent to be able to go and be there in person, and substantially having Nick there to guide me and explain the different facets of the ecosystem, and it was really, really fascinating. But on a more somber note, it was very visible. There was a lot of cases where you could really see the impact of the spill, even 2 years on. Even though a lot of people, including Nick, a lot of Mauritians spent many, many, many hours putting themselves in harm's way to clean the oil, and in many cases, literally with toothbrushes, scrubbing the porous coral rock and literally on the ground, scrubbing it. But unfortunately, the negative effects of the oil, despite all that hard work, are still present. And that was clear, everything from the vegetation. You could see where the oil had been washed on. The vegetation was still very unhealthy and not green as compared to where it hadn't reached, where the oil hadn't reached, and the vegetation was still healthy. And then that, of course, reverberates through the food chain, and of course the skinks themselves, as Nick pointed out to me. Many individuals were sluggish, slow, as opposed to their usual behavior, which of course is very fast, and they have to catch them for the purpose of studying them. Usually they're incredibly difficult to catch, and you're running around the rocks trying to catch these small animals. But I was able to pick them up, and Nick was able to pick them up too easily. And there's a lot of those different behaviors. And in fact, a lot of the reasons are not well understood yet, and he's still studying them and still trying to find out how we can mitigate those negative effects to this day, still now in their wild habitat.
Which again, I think just reinforces, completely underlines the significance of getting that population off, because this is something that's going to take years, isn't it? Years and years before they can be introduced, if they can be introduced. So that genuine saving a species thing, Margaret Mead, there's that great quote from Margaret Mead saying, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And the fact that this small group of committed individuals took this decision and changed and saved those species is hugely significant. You should be massively proud of yourselves for what you did. It's an extraordinary thing. So, Lesley, we've talked a lot about species, and we've talked about projects, and we've talked about ongoing work that's critical, absolutely critical. And so how can people help and get involved in those projects?
Well, like everything else in life, it does take support and funding. We're very effective with how we use funding, but of course none of these things can happen without committed supporters helping us. The three projects we've talked about this evening, the racers, the mountain chickens, and the ongoing work with the Mauritian reptiles, collectively that costs about £250,000 a year for those three projects. And it's a lot of money, but at the same time we're talking about some of the most critically endangered animals on Earth. The rarest snake in the world, and we have a chance to act. It's what, like Carl said earlier, if we can save these ones, there's no reason we can't save them all. What it takes is support and help and funding. There's no reason that this can't happen in terms of saving species.
And the interesting thing tonight, one of my overwhelming impressions tonight, is the knock-on effect of saving an individual animal in terms of ecosystem health.
Yeah.
Not just because it's an iconic or a poster species. it's the knock-on effect on the ecosystem is so significant.
It's huge. You know, if you think about, you know, you ask Carol about, well, what does it matter if you save a snake, like a racer? What does it matter? You know, biodiversity is like a giant Jenga tower. And we are pulling blocks out of the Jenga tower as we have this giant experiment with how we use the earth, which is what we're effectively doing. Now, one individual block, do we care about that individual block if that's a little gecko? But at some point the tower is going to fall over. So we need to stabilize it as much as possible, and that's each of these little species in and of themselves. You think, okay, why do they matter? They matter because they're helping the stability of the entire tower that is our home, planet Earth, our home. We keep pulling these little blocks out, we're going to destabilize the whole thing.
I think on that very point that we're at potentially quite a grim phase in our relationship with the natural world, aren't we? There's a lot of species right on the edge, a lot of ecosystems suffering, but we have a rare opportunity as well in that the actions that we take now can make a genuine difference. The numbers are that critical. We're at such a significant moment in time and space and the evolution of our relationship with the natural world, that what we do now makes a genuine difference, because that's the numbers we're playing with. Absolutely. And you can wear it as a badge of honor for the rest of your life, can't you? You can put your feet up, Louis Pierre, by the way. You saved a species, you saved 3. So, I think you can wear it as a badge of honor for the rest of your life, that you actually did something. And it's the one question I get asked, I think, more than anything in conservation is, what can I do as an individual? And I always say there is something we can all do, and supporting Durrell is a massive part of that, I think.
Well, so. You like to use quotes, Monty, so do I, but this one, I used it actually in an event we did a few years back, but I really love it, and it's actually from a Scottish pop group of my youth, and they had a song called Ordinary Angel, and it talks about being an everyday hero. To be an ordinary angel, that's what we can all be.
I'm going to try and finish on a quote, and then we're going to do Q&A, but I constantly mangle this quote, so I might have to have a few goes at it. There's a great Hemingway quote that says, "Today is only one day in all the days that will ever be, but what will happen in every day that ever comes can depend on what you do today." So, there we go. That's a nice way to finish. Well, thank you very much for joining us in what was an extraordinary event. Now, do remember that all of the work that we've seen can't continue without your help. All of the species that we featured desperately need this work to continue. Now, you can contribute by joining Durrell, or there's links to donate on the website. So please do get in touch. Thanks very much.